Justice supposedly wears a blindfold. But inside that courtroom, everyone saw the fatal mistake coming except the man holding the weapon. Silence shattered when a rogue deputy, cornered by his own undeniable corruption, drew a loaded Glock on a military police officer, taking the witness stand against him. Chaos erupted instantly. Spectators screamed. Bailiffs froze in their tracks, but Captain Kendra Blake did not flinch. Decades of elite tactical training kicked in before conscious thought even registered the threat. What unfolded next was not a tragic shootout. It was a brutal, televised masterclass in kinetic neutralization. Mere moments. That was all it took for a decorated bully to lose his pride, his weapon, and his freedom, triggering a domino effect of unyielding karma that would tear through an entire city's corrupt establishment. The municipalities surrounding the sprawling military base had always shared an uneasy, symbiotic relationship with it. The local economy thrived on the soldiers, but the jurisdictional lines between civilian law enforcement and the military were constantly blurred. Captain Kendra Blake, an investigator with the Military Police Criminal Investigation Division, knew where those lines were drawn better than anyone. She was a woman built of uncompromising principles, possessing a steely gaze that had unraveled hardened felons and a perfectly pressed uniform that symbolized her devotion to order. Her current target, however, wore a badge of his own. Deputy Chief Vance Collier of the County Sheriff's Department was a man who operated under the assumption that the badge he wore granted him immunity from consequence. For years, Collier had run a quiet, highly profitable extortion racket targeting young enlisted soldiers. His method was cruel but effective. His deputies would plant narcotics in the vehicles of privates and corporals during routine traffic stops off base. Faced with the end of their military careers and long terms in state prison, the terrified young men and women would empty their savings accounts, take out high-interest payday loans, or surrender their valuable possessions to make the charges disappear. Collier was a large man, carrying the bulk of an aging athlete who had substituted whiskey and steak for time in the gym. He possessed a booming voice, a network of favors deeply embedded in the local judicial system, and a terrifyingly fragile ego. He had never been challenged, not truly. Not until he made the catastrophic error of targeting Private Devin Sawyer. Sawyer was a young mechanic from Ohio barely into his enlistment, and more importantly, he was the nephew of a 3-star general stationed at the Pentagon. When Collier's men pulled Sawyer over, planted methamphetamine in his trunk, and demanded a substantial sum for their silence, Sawyer did not crack. He called his commanding officer, who immediately involved the division. The case landed squarely on the desk of Captain Blake. Kendra did not rush. She did not make public accusations. She operated with the silent, lethal precision of a striking snake. Over the course of a thorough investigation, she built an ironclad case. She bypassed the local authorities entirely, working with federal prosecutors and utilizing federal wiretaps. She tracked the serial numbers of the seized cash. She found the burner phones Collier used to coordinate the drops. She even flipped 2 of Collier's junior deputies, men who were too young to go down for a sinking ship, offering them federal immunity in exchange for their damning testimony. When the indictment finally dropped, it hit the county like a localized earthquake. Vance Collier was arrested by FBI agents in his own driveway, his neighborhood watching in stunned silence as the untouchable deputy chief was shoved into the back of an unmarked sedan. But Collier was not a man to surrender. Released on massive bail, he immediately went to work utilizing his remaining loyalists. He intimidated witnesses. He had his lawyer, a ruthless bulldog named Marcus Hale, file endless motions to suppress evidence, claiming military overreach and illegal surveillance. He even orchestrated a smear campaign against Captain Blake, leaking fabricated stories to local tabloids about her supposed history of insubordination and anti-police bias. Kendra ignored the noise. She polished her brass, reviewed her files, and waited for her day in court. She knew that men like Collier, men who had spent their entire lives operating under the illusion of absolute power, became their own worst enemies when cornered. She anticipated he would try something desperate. She just did not realize how desperate he would become. The trial date arrived. The county superior court was a relic of an earlier era, a grand, imposing structure of marble and heavy oak that felt suffocatingly hot despite the struggling air conditioning units. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was electric. Every seat in the gallery was filled, populated by local reporters, off-duty police officers showing solidarity for Collier, and military personnel silently supporting their captain. Collier arrived wearing a custom-tailored suit that barely concealed his nervous, aggressive energy. He sneered at the cameras, portraying the image of a wrongfully accused patriot. But beneath the bluster, his empire was crumbling, and the sheer terror of spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary was beginning to fracture his sanity. Courtroom 4B was an arena built for quiet intellectual warfare, dominated by the imposing mahogany bench where Judge Victoria Langford presided. Langford was a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for maintaining strict courtroom decorum. She had grown increasingly irritated by the circus-like atmosphere Marcus Hale was attempting to cultivate around the trial. Prosecutor Ryan Whitaker, a sharp, meticulous attorney borrowed from the federal circuit to ensure impartiality, called his star witness to the stand on the morning of the third day. The prosecution calls Captain Kendra Blake. A murmur rippled through the gallery as Kendra stood from the prosecution's bench. She was dressed in her Class A uniform, every ribbon and medal perfectly aligned, her posture impeccably straight. She moved with a quiet, powerful grace, her face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. As she walked past the defense table, Collier visibly bristled, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He leaned over to his attorney, whispering something venomous, but Hale waved him off, frantically reviewing his notes. Kendra took the oath, her voice clear and steady, and sat in the witness box. For the next several hours, Whitaker led her through the labyrinthine details of the investigation. With surgical precision, Kendra dismantled every defense Collier had constructed. Whitaker projected financial records onto a large screen. Captain Blake, can you explain the correlation between the dates of these unauthorized traffic stops and the deposits made into the offshore account belonging to the defendant's brother-in-law? Yes, Mr. Whitaker, Kendra replied, her tone conversational but authoritative. Within a short period after every documented stop involving a shakedown, a cash deposit matching the exact amount extorted from the military personnel was made into the Cayman account. We traced the serial numbers from the bait money provided to Private Sawyer directly to a physical deposit made by Mr. Collier at a branch in Atlanta. Hale objected relentlessly, but Judge Langford overruled him time and time again. The evidence was simply too solid. It was not based on hearsay. It was a digital and physical paper trail impossible to refute. From the witness stand, Kendra kept her gaze strictly on the prosecutor and the jury. She deliberately avoided looking at Collier, knowing that acknowledging him would only fuel his narcissism. But in her peripheral vision, she could see him unraveling. He was shifting violently in his chair. He was sweating profusely, dabbing at his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. The arrogant sneer had vanished, replaced by the cornered look of a panicked animal. The turning point came during the presentation of the audio evidence. Whitaker played a recorded phone call between Collier and one of the flipped deputies. In the recording, Collier's voice was unmistakable, aggressively instructing the junior officer to make sure the kid finds the baggie under the passenger seat before you tow the damn car. When the recording ended, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. The off-duty officers in the gallery, who had previously been whispering words of support, were now staring at the floor in profound embarrassment. The jury looked openly disgusted. Captain Blake, Whitaker asked softly, breaking the silence. Is there any doubt in your professional assessment regarding the identity of the voice on that tape? None whatsoever, Kendra answered clearly. It is the voice of Vance Collier, orchestrating the false imprisonment and extortion of an innocent soldier. Collier slammed his hands down on the defense table. The loud crack echoed through the high-ceilinged room like a gunshot, causing several jurors to jump. Lies! Collier bellowed, his voice raw and hysterical. She is setting me up. The military wants to take over the town. She fabricated all of it. Mr. Collier, sit down and remain silent, Judge Langford commanded, striking her gavel sharply. Mr. Hale, control your client or I will have him removed and remanded to custody immediately. Hale grabbed Collier's arm, trying to pull him back into his chair. Vance, shut up. You are killing us, Hale hissed, visibly terrified by his client's outburst. but the powder keg had been ignited. Collier ripped his arm away from his lawyer. The reality of his situation had finally pierced his delusions of grandeur. He was not just losing the trial, he was losing his freedom, his pension, his status, his entire identity. He looked around the room, seeing the disgusted faces of the jury, the cold professionalism of the judge, and finally, his eyes locked onto Captain Kendra Blake. She sat there perfectly composed, observing his meltdown with the analytical detachment of a scientist watching a predictable chemical reaction. That composure, that absolute lack of fear or intimidation, snapped the final frayed thread of Collier's sanity. Because of his status as a former high-ranking law enforcement officer who had received death threats prior to the trial, Collier had been granted controversial leniency. He had bypassed standard metal detectors, entering through a secure side door, usually reserved for judges and staff. It was a courtesy that relied on honor, an honor Collier had abandoned long ago. He reached down to his right ankle. Time in a crisis does not flow linearly. It expands, dilates, and fractures into micro-moments. For the untrained eye, the sequence of events was a sudden, incomprehensible blur of motion and screaming. For Captain Kendra Blake, it was a slow-motion checklist of threat assessment and tactical response. Collier stands abruptly, violently, knocking his heavy oak chair backward. It crashes to the floor. The sound draws every eye in the room. Collier lunges to the side, pulling up the hem of his tailored trousers. His hand violently jerks upward, clearing a subcompact matte black Glock from an ankle holster. Someone in the gallery screams. Judge Langford gasps, reaching for the panic button beneath her desk. Prosecutor Whitaker freezes, his mouth falling open. The bailiffs stationed at the doors reach for their weapons, but they are entirely too far. They are out of the equation. Collier raises the weapon, his face contorted in a mask of pure homicidal rage, screaming an incoherent string of obscenities. The barrel begins to level toward the witness box, toward Kendra. In military close-quarters combat training, operators are taught that action is always faster than reaction, but only if the action is singular and the reaction is trained to the point of muscle memory. Kendra did not think about diving for cover. She did not think about drawing her own weapon, which she was strictly forbidden from carrying into the courtroom. She analyzed the distance. A short gap separated the witness box from the defense table. The half wall of the witness stand was between them. Kendra explodes forward. She vaults the swinging wooden gate of the witness box with terrifying speed, clearing the obstacle without her boots even touching the top frame. She is a missile, closing the gap before Collier can fully acquire his sight picture. Collier sees the blur of dark green uniform flying toward him. His eyes widen in sudden shock. He jerks the trigger, but his alignment is thrown off by the sheer unexpected aggression of his target. The gun discharges. The deafening crack of the round shatters the acoustic paneling high up on the wall, missing Kendra's head by a comfortable margin. Kendra makes contact. She does not throw a punch. Punches are unpredictable. She executes a flawless, brutal disarm technique. Her left hand shoots forward, executing a vicious clamp grip directly over the hot slide and barrel of the Glock, violently redirecting the muzzle away from her body and toward the ceiling. At the exact same microsecond, her right hand strikes the inside of Collier's wrist with the hardened edge of her palm, targeting the radial nerve. The nerve strike momentarily deadens Collier's hand. His grip involuntarily opens. Kendra violently twists the weapon back against Collier's thumb, breaking his mechanical leverage. The gun pops free from his hand, sliding harmlessly across the polished floor toward the jury box. The weapon is secured, but the threat is still standing. Kendra uses the momentum of the disarm to pivot. She drops her center of gravity, steps deeply behind Collier's lead leg, and drives her elbow sharply into his sternum while simultaneously sweeping his leg out from under him. The physics are undeniable. The large, heavy man is completely uprooted. Collier flies backward, his feet entirely leaving the floor. He crashes down onto the hard wooden planks of the courtroom with a sickening, heavy thud that rattles the nearest benches. The wind is violently expelled from his lungs in a wet gasp. Before Collier can even register the blinding pain in his back and chest, Kendra is on him. She drops her full body weight, driving her knee directly into his spine, pinning him flat to the floor. She grabs his right arm, violently torquing it behind his back into a shoulder lock that commands absolute, agonizing compliance. "Move, and I break it," Kendra states. Her voice is not raised. It is not frantic. It is ice cold, cutting through the sudden ringing silence of the courtroom like a scalpel. For 3 excruciating seconds, nobody breathes. The smell of burnt cordite hangs sharply in the air. The dust from the shattered wall panel slowly drifts down over the prosecution table. Then, the pandemonium breaks. The bailiffs finally arrive, their weapons drawn, shouting overlapping commands. "Stand down." "I have control of the suspect," Kendra orders, her voice finally projecting with military authority, cutting through the chaos. She looks up at the closest bailiff, a young, pale man whose hands are visibly shaking. "Secure this weapon. Bring me cuffs now." The bailiff scrambles forward, holstering his own weapon and fumbling a set of steel handcuffs from his belt. He hands them to Kendra. With practiced efficiency, she snaps the steel around Collier's wrists, ratcheting them tight. Only then does she stand up. She brushes a speck of dust off the sleeve of her uniform. She looks down at Collier, who is writhing on the floor, gasping for breath, humiliated, defeated, and now definitively damned. "Your Honor," Kendra says, turning to face Judge Langford, who is still standing behind the bench, clutching the edges of her desk with white knuckles. "The witness box is secure. I am ready to continue my testimony whenever the court sees fit." Judge Langford stares at the military police officer, her mouth slightly agape. She looks down at the bleeding, handcuffed former deputy chief, then over to the bullet hole in her pristine courtroom wall. Court is in recess. Langford stammers, banging the gavel with a shaking hand. As paramedics and additional police swarm into the room, a lone reporter in the third row, who had managed to keep his smartphone recording audio throughout the entire ordeal, hit send to his editor. The local corruption trial of Vance Collier had just ended. But the story of the military police officer who dropped an armed man in mere moments was about to go national, and the karma coming for the rest of Collier's network had not even begun to hit. The echo of Judge Victoria Langford's gavel had barely faded before the digital shockwave hit the outside world. The lone reporter in the third row, a cynical beat writer named Kai Donovan for the County Herald, had not just captured audio. Through a stroke of sheer journalistic luck and a blatant disregard for courtroom electronic policies, he had managed to position his smartphone lens through a gap in the wooden benches ahead of him. He captured the entire agonizing sequence in high definition. Within a short time of the courtroom being evacuated, the brief clip was uploaded to a secure server, blasted across social media algorithms, and picked up by every major syndicated news network in the country. It was immediately dubbed the courtroom takedown. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the courthouse holding cells, Vance Collier was experiencing a catastrophic crash of adrenaline. Stripped of his custom-tailored suit jacket, his tie confiscated as a suicide hazard, he sat slumped on a stainless steel bench. His right arm was secured in a rudimentary sling provided by the paramedics. Captain Blake's shoulder lock had severely torn his rotator cuff and dislocated the joint. His chest throbbed with every shallow breath, a testament to the brutal knee strike that had driven the oxygen from his lungs. But the physical pain was a distant secondary concern to the psychological annihilation he was enduring. For years, Collier had been the apex predator of the county. He had walked through those very holding cells hundreds of times, taunting terrified suspects, projecting an aura of untouchable, aggressive authority. Now, the local deputies, men he had hired, promoted, and bullied, walked past his cell with their eyes averted. Nobody offered him a cup of coffee. Nobody offered a word of sympathy. They looked at him not as a fallen leader, but as a radioactive liability. They had all seen the video. They had watched a woman half his size systematically dismantle him physically and professionally in the time it took to draw a breath, 2 floors above in a commandeered conference room. The damage control was already failing. Mayor Thomas Harrison and Police Chief Gregory Dunn were locked in a screaming match with Collier's defense attorney, Marcus Hale. "You assured me he was stable, Marcus," Mayor Harrison bellowed, pacing the length of the room, his face slick with panic sweat. "You said the military's case was circumstantial and we could weather the storm. He just pulled a firearm on a federal witness in open court. Do you understand what this does to the city's municipal bond ratings? Do you understand what this does to my re-election? Do not put this on me, Thomas." Hale shot back, frantically packing his leather briefcase. The lawyer's usual arrogant veneer had completely evaporated. My client suffered an acute psychological break under the pressure of cross-examination. It is temporary insanity. I can work with it, but I need you to secure the local district attorney. We need to frame this as an emotional collapse, not a premeditated hit. There is no we anymore, counselor. A chillingly calm voice interrupted from the doorway. The three men turned to see Special Agent Darius Kane of the FBI standing in the threshold. Behind him stood 4 federal agents wearing tactical vests. Kane walked into the room, tossing a thick manila folder onto the mahogany table. The local district attorney is recusing himself as of recently, Kane stated, his eyes locking onto Chief Dunn. Vance Collier is no longer in county custody. We are transferring him to a federal holding facility. He is being charged with attempted murder of a federal officer, witness intimidation, and discharging a firearm in a federal proceeding on top of the existing counts of extortion and wire fraud. Chief Dunn swallowed hard. Agent Kane, the county police department is fully prepared to handle the internal investigation regarding the weapon. Chief Dunn, as of this moment, your department is considered compromised. Kane cut him off sharply. The FBI and the Military Police Criminal Investigation Division are initiating a joint task force to audit every single arrest, seizure, and asset forfeiture your department has executed in the past. Collier did not smuggle that Glock through a metal detector by magic. Someone let him through the side door. We're going to find out who, and then we're going to find out what else they have been letting slide. Kane leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. Collier just blew the lid off this town. I suggest you gentlemen hire very expensive, very independent legal counsel. Meanwhile, a short distance away within the secure perimeter of the military base, Captain Kendra Blake sat quietly in the austere office of her commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Ford. She had been escorted directly from the courthouse by a heavily armed convoy of military police, a standard protocol following a lethal force incident. She was currently undergoing a mandatory psychological debriefing, though she looked entirely unaffected. Colonel Ford, a decorated combat veteran with silver hair and a deeply lined face, paused the tablet on his desk. He was watching the video of the courtroom altercation for the dozenth time. He zoomed in on the exact microsecond Kendra clamped her hand over the slide of Collier's pistol. Your heart rate data from your smartwatch during the incident was downloaded by the medic, Captain, Ford said slowly, looking up from the screen. Remarkably steady. Most people are pushing high when they stare down the barrel of a loaded weapon. Panic is a tactical error, sir, Kendra replied evenly, her posture perfectly rigid. The threat assessment dictated an immediate kinetic response. The distance was too short for evasion, and seeking cover would have allowed the suspect to acquire a secondary target, likely the judge or the prosecutor. Closing the distance and securing the weapon was the only viable mathematical probability for minimizing casualties. Ford nodded, a mixture of profound relief and deep professional admiration washing over him. The media is calling you a superhero, Kendra. The Pentagon wants to put you on a press tour to boost recruitment numbers, but the legal team is worried. Collier's lawyers are already spinning a narrative that you used excessive force. They are going to try and say your martial arts training makes you a lethal weapon and you overreacted to an old man having a breakdown. Kendra's expression did not change. Let them say whatever they wish, Colonel. Physics and video evidence are immune to narrative spin. He produced a deadly weapon. I removed it. I stopped applying force the exact second compliance was achieved. If they wish to argue that in a federal court, I will be happy to take the stand again. Ford nodded slowly. Get some rest, Captain. You are on mandatory administrative leave, but keep your phone on. Collier just kicked a hornet's nest, and I have a feeling we are going to be busy catching the ones that fly out. He was entirely correct. The gunshot in that courtroom was not the end of the war. It was the flare illuminating the battlefield. Karma in the real world rarely manifests as a mystical sudden stroke of lightning. It is usually bureaucratic, methodical, and profoundly humiliating. For Vance Collier, the universe's retribution arrived not as a single blow, but as a slow, crushing avalanche of consequences triggered by his own hubris and accelerated by the undeniable proof of his cowardice. The first domino to fall was his defense strategy. Marcus Hale, the ruthless bulldog attorney who had promised to keep Collier out of prison, visited him in the federal detention center shortly after the courtroom incident. The meeting took place in a windowless room, separated by a thick sheet of plexiglass. Collier, looking aged and broken in an oversized orange jumpsuit, his arm still strapped tightly to his chest, picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. "Marcus, you got to get me out of here," Collier pleaded, his voice cracking. "The guards here, they know I am a cop. They are putting me in general population for recreation. It is a death sentence. You need to file an emergency motion for solitary or bail or medical release." "I'm not filing anything, Vance," Hale interrupted, his voice flat and void of its usual theatrical empathy. Collier blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Hale slid a single sheet of paper through the small metal slot beneath the glass. "That is a formal notice of withdrawal as your legal counsel. As of this morning, my firm no longer represents you." "You cannot do that," Collier yelled, slamming his good hand against the glass. "I paid you a substantial retainer. You work for me." "That retainer was seized by the Treasury Department recently," Hale explained coldly. "The FBI traced the origin of those funds. They came from the Cayman account. The one you swore was legitimate family inheritance. It is dirty money, Vance, which means I cannot touch it without catching a money laundering charge myself. Furthermore, since you decided to commit a violent felony in front of a judge, a jury, and a camera, you have rendered yourself indefensible. I am a lawyer, not a miracle worker. Good luck with the public defender." Hale hung up the phone and walked away without looking back, leaving Collier screaming impotently against the soundproof glass. But the loss of his lawyer was merely the prologue to the nightmare. The viral video of the courtroom takedown had an unintended profound psychological effect on the community. For years, the citizens of the county, particularly the marginalized and the young enlisted soldiers, had lived in silent terror of Collier and his deputies. He was viewed as an invincible force of nature, but watching him be effortlessly swept off his feet, disarmed, and pinned to the floor by Captain Blake shattered that illusion of invincibility. He was not a god. He was just a bully who relied on a badge to do his fighting for him. And once a bully is shown to be weak, the victims stop hiding. Within a short time of the incident, the FBI tip line established for the county corruption probe was overwhelmed. It started as a trickle and quickly became a flood. Local business owners came forward with ledgers proving they had been paying protection fees to Collier's deputies for years to avoid targeted harassment. Single mothers produced bank statements showing they had been forced to pay exorbitant cash fines directly to deputies on the side of the highway to prevent their cars from being impounded. The two junior deputies who had originally flipped for Captain Blake, Officer Ellis and Officer Davis, saw the writing on the wall. Realizing that loyalty to Collier was now a one-way ticket to a maximum security federal penitentiary, they demanded a new meeting with Agent Kane and federal prosecutors. They decided to stop holding back the really damaging information. Collier was not acting alone. Davis confessed in a recorded deposition, his hands trembling as he smoked a nervous cigarette. He was the muscle, but he was not the brains. "You need to look at the municipal court, specifically Judge Harrison." The revelation sent shockwaves through the task force. Judge William Harrison was the older brother of the current mayor, Thomas Harrison. "Explain," Kane demanded. "The shakedowns only worked because the victims were terrified of going to jail." Davis continued, "When we pulled over a soldier and planted the methamphetamine, Collier would immediately call Judge Harrison. The judge would pre-sign a search warrant and set an astronomically high bail amount before the kid even got processed at the station. It was a pressure cooker. We would tell the kid, you are looking at $500,000 in bail and a long term in state prison, or you can surrender the title to your Mustang and empty your checking account right now. And the evidence disappears. We kick a percentage of every score up to the judge to keep the warrants flowing. The karma loop was closing tightly. Captain Blake's initial investigation had aimed to cut the head off a snake. She had inadvertently blown up the entire nest. Operation House of Cards was launched by the Department of Justice. It was a synchronized, devastating strike against the systemic rot of the county. Black armored vehicles descended upon the town. Mayor Thomas Harrison was arrested at his country club, pulled out of the dining room in handcuffs, while his wealthy constituents watched in stunned silence. Judge William Harrison was apprehended in his chambers, federal agents seizing his hard drives and freezing his pension accounts. Police Chief Gregory Dunn, realizing the net was closing, attempted to flee to Mexico, but was intercepted by U.S. Marshals at a regional airport in Texas. By the end of the operation, multiple individuals had been federally indicted. The network of extortion, bribery, and civil rights violations that Collier had meticulously built over the years collapsed in spectacular fashion. The state legislature placed the county sheriff's department under emergency receivership, essentially disbanding the corrupt unit and replacing them with state troopers while the department was rebuilt from the ground up. As for Vance Collier, the hard reality of his new life set in during his sentencing hearing. The trial had been moved to a federal courthouse to avoid the tainted jury pool of his hometown. He stood before a federal judge looking gaunt and hollowed out. His wife had filed for divorce, taking their children and changing their last names to escape the unbearable public shame. His assets had been entirely seized to pay restitution to the hundreds of victims he had extorted. He had nothing left but the orange jumpsuit on his back. When the judge handed down a lengthy sentence without the possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence for a man his age, Collier did not scream. He did not pound the table. He simply slumped forward, the last remnants of his arrogance finally extinguished by the crushing weight of absolute accountability. Back at the military base, Captain Kendra Blake sat at her pristine desk, reviewing a new case file. Her promotion to major had been fast-tracked and approved by the Pentagon, a silent acknowledgement of her exceptional composure under fire. She watched a brief news segment detailing Collier's sentencing on the small television in the corner of the bullpen. A junior investigator walked by and paused, looking at the screen. A lengthy sentence. "Hard to believe one guy caused all that damage, ma'am." Kendra picked up her pen, her eyes returning to the evidence log in front of her. "He did not cause it alone," she replied quietly. "He just made the mistake of thinking gravity did not apply to him, and gravity always wins." The federal penitentiary in Atlanta is a monolithic fortress of weathered stone and steel that has housed some of the most dangerous criminals in American history. For Vance Collier, it was not merely a prison, it was a concrete tomb where his past came to collect its debts with compounding interest. Collier had desperately clung to the belief that, even behind bars, his sheer size and former authority would grant him a baseline of respect. He was profoundly mistaken. In the twisted hierarchy of federal lockup, a corrupt cop who preyed on vulnerable kids was relegated to the absolute bottom of the food chain, existing somewhere below informants and thieves. Within his first short time in the general population, the unspoken rules of his new reality were violently enforced. It happened in the recreation yard, a desolate expanse of cracked asphalt baking beneath the Georgia sun. Collier was attempting to walk the perimeter, keeping his head down, his dislocated shoulder still throbbing in its sling. He was flanked by 3 men. They did not wear uniforms. They wore standard-issue khaki, but they moved with the lethal, coordinated precision of a predator pack. The man in the center was Victor Langford. Langford was not a gangbanger or a street thug. He was a highly educated, meticulously groomed associate of a crime family, a syndicate operating a massive logistics and narcotics network out of the broader region. "Deputy Chief Collier," Langford said softly, falling into step beside the large, sweating man. His voice was entirely conversational, stripped of any overt malice, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Collier stiffened, his eyes darting toward the guard towers. The guards were inexplicably looking the other way. "I do not know you." "Back off." "You do not know my face, Vance, but you know my money," Langford continued, pulling a small folded piece of paper from his pocket. "You see, when the FBI raided your lovely home in the county and froze that offshore account in the Caymans, they did not just seize the nickels and dimes you shook down from those poor army kids. They seized everything in the ledger." Collier's blood ran cold. The temperature in the yard seemed to plummet despite the blazing heat. "We had an arrangement, Vance," Langford said, stepping slightly closer. "My associates paid you a very handsome monthly sum in clean, untraceable crypto to ensure your deputies never set up speed traps on the interstate between the hours of midnight and early morning. It was a simple, mutually beneficial transit corridor for our freight. And because you were a greedy, sloppy amateur who could not keep his temper in check, you brought the entire weight of the Federal Bureau of Investigation down on our supply line." "I did not say a word about you," Collier stammered, his bravado entirely shattered. His knees felt weak. "I swear to God, I kept my mouth shut." "The feds do not know about the interstate arrangement. They do not have to." Langford smiled, a thin, mirthless expression. "When they seized your accounts, they confiscated a substantial amount of our operational capital that you were supposed to be washing through your brother-in-law's shell companies. You cost my employers a fortune, Vance. And in our line of work, gross negligence is treated the exact same way as intentional theft." Langford stopped walking. The two men flanking him seamlessly boxed Collier in, blocking him from the view of the nearest security camera. "We know your ex-wife Sarah relocated to a townhouse in a nearby suburb. We know your daughter goes to the magnet school on the local street," Langford whispered, leaning in so close Collier could smell the mint on his breath. "You are going to spend the rest of your pathetic life in this cage, Vance, but you are going to work off your debt. Every dime you make in the prison laundry, every package of commissary you receive, every favor you can leverage, it belongs to us. If you refuse, or if you ask for protective custody, we will balance the ledger with your family on the outside. Do you understand?" Collier could not speak. He was hyperventilating, the crushing weight of absolute, inescapable entrapment bearing down on his chest. For years he had threatened to ruin the lives of young, terrified men if they did not pay him off. Now, the universe had delivered an agonizingly perfect mirror of his own cruelty. He nodded slowly, a single tear cutting through the dirt on his weathered cheek. He was no longer a man. He was property. Shortly after, a short distance to the north, Captain Kendra Blake stepped out of a black government SUV in Arlington, Virginia. She was not wearing her standard duty uniform. She was dressed in a pristine dress blue uniform. Summoned to the Pentagon by the highest echelons of military command, she was escorted through the labyrinthine corridors of the Department of Defense, her polished boots clicking rhythmically against the terrazzo floors. She was finally ushered into a secure, soundproof briefing room deep within the E-ring. Waiting for her was Lieutenant General Harlan Prescott, a man whose stern, battle-hardened features were practically carved from granite. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, and more importantly, he was the uncle of Private Devin Sawyer, the young soldier whose arrest had sparked the entire county operation. "Have a seat, Major Blake," General Prescott said, emphasizing her newly minted rank. He gestured to a leather chair across the heavy oak table. "Thank you, sir," Kendra replied, sitting with perfect, rigid posture. Prescott pushed a thick classified file across the table. "I wanted to debrief you personally on the conclusion of Operation House of Cards. The Department of Justice has officially indicted multiple individuals, including 2 state senators who were taking kickbacks from Mayor Harrison's municipal bond schemes. The county's corrupt infrastructure has been entirely eradicated." "It was a successful joint operation, sir. Agent Kane and the FBI task force were highly efficient," Kendra stated neutrally. Prescott leaned back, steepling his fingers. "It was efficient, Kendra, because it was designed to be. I am not a man who believes in coincidences, and I certainly do not believe in leaving the safety of my soldiers to the whims of local corrupt municipalities." Kendra's brow furrowed imperceptibly. "Sir, the county has been a black mark on our radar for years," Prescott explained, his voice dropping an octave. "We had statistical anomalies, DUI arrests, civil asset forfeitures, drug possession charges that were statistically impossible for a base of our size. We knew someone was hunting our boys. The problem was jurisdiction. The Posse Comitatus Act legally prevented military intelligence from spying on local law enforcement. We could not investigate Collier without a massive, undeniable inciting incident." Prescott paused, looking Kendra dead in the eyes. "Private Sawyer did not just happen to get pulled over, Major. He volunteered. We knew exactly which stretch of road Collier's men used for their shakedowns. We knew their operating hours. Sawyer drove that route every Friday night for several weeks, driving a flashy car bought with deployment money, playing the perfect naive target. He allowed himself to be framed." The room went entirely silent. Kendra processed the tactical brilliance and the terrifying risk of the strategy. "You used your own nephew as bait. He is a soldier. He understood the mission," Prescott replied without a hint of apology. "But bait is useless without the right trap. When Sawyer triggered the arrest, I personally ensured the file was routed directly to your desk at CID. Kendra stared at the general. Why me, sir? Because of your psychological profile, Kendra, Prescott said, tapping the file on the table. You have the highest closing rate in CID, but more importantly, you possess a total uncompromising lack of political deference. We modeled the scenario. We knew Collier was arrogant. We knew he would try to intimidate the investigator. If I sent a man, Collier might have tried to negotiate or compromise or establish some twisted brotherhood of the badge. But you, we knew your mere presence. A disciplined, unyielding female officer would drive a narcissist like Collier absolutely insane. You were precisely the weapon we needed to make him overreact and expose his entire network. Prescott offered a rare, grim smile. We expected him to slip up on a wiretap or perhaps try to bribe you. We did not expect him to pull a firearm in a federal courtroom. Your physical neutralization of the target was not in the mission parameters, but it was highly effective. Kendra absorbed the revelation. She had always viewed the law as a straight line, a blindfolded pursuit of facts. Discovering she was a guided missile fired by the Pentagon's intelligence apparatus did not anger her. It simply realigned her understanding of the battlefield. The mission was accomplished, Major Blake said smoothly, rising to her feet and delivering a crisp salute. The threat to our personnel has been neutralized. Dismissed, Major. Prescott returned the salute, and well done. The concept of karma is often misunderstood as a mystical scale that magically rights the wrongs of the world. In reality, karma is a mechanism built by the aggregate actions of human beings. It is the inevitable crushing weight of consequences. For the town, karma brought a painful, agonizing rebirth. The financial ruin left behind by Mayor Harrison and Judge William Harrison plunged the municipality into bankruptcy. The millions of dollars stolen through corrupt court fees and asset forfeitures had to be repaid, resulting in massive tax hikes and the liquidation of city assets. The once proud county police department was dissolved entirely, replaced by a regional precinct monitored heavily by a civilian oversight committee and a permanent military liaison from the base. The people of the county, who had turned a blind eye to the suffering of the soldiers as long as their own neighborhoods were quiet, were forced to reckon with the moral rot of their complacency. They had traded justice for an illusion of security, and the interest on that transaction had bankrupted them. But the most profound transformation occurred in the dark, sweltering corridors of the federal penitentiary. Vance Collier had spent his entire adult life operating under the delusion that he was the apex predator, the wolf walking among sheep. The reality of his existence in prison systematically stripped away every layer of that delusion until nothing remained but a hollow, terrified shell under the suffocating thumb of the Langford Syndicate. Collier became a ghost. He was forced into the prison laundry detail, working long shifts in a windowless, unair-conditioned basement, scrubbing the soiled linens of the men he used to arrest. Every penny he earned, every extra ration he received, was immediately seized by Langford's enforcers. He was not permitted to look the made men in the eye. He was not permitted to speak unless spoken to. The physical toll was devastating. Collier lost substantial weight within his first period of incarceration. His hair fell out in clumps due to severe stress. The dislocated shoulder he suffered at the hands of Captain Blake never healed properly, leaving his right arm permanently weakened and plagued by chronic burning arthritis. But the psychological torment was worse. Collier was a man who craved an audience, who fed on the fear and respect of others. In the penitentiary, he was entirely invisible. On the rare occasions he was recognized by younger inmates who had seen the viral video of his courtroom humiliation, he was mocked mercilessly. They called him the Quick Drop Cop, a moniker that provoked uproarious laughter in the cell blocks. Collier lacked the strength, the allies, and the courage to fight back. He simply kept his head down, clutching a mop, entirely broken. The final definitive blow of karma arrived one morning, delivered in a standard manila legal envelope. Collier sat on his thin mattress in his small cell, his reading glasses taped together at the bridge, and opened the letter. It was a court order from the federal district, a massive class-action lawsuit led by Private Devin Sawyer and joined by hundreds of former and active duty service members had reached its conclusion. The plaintiffs had sued Collier, the former mayor, and the dissolved city for civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and emotional distress. The federal judge had ruled entirely in favor of the soldiers. Because Collier's dirty money had already been seized by the FBI, the civil judgment targeted his legitimate assets. The court ordered the immediate liquidation of his state pension, the seizure of his remaining life insurance policies, and the forced sale of his deceased mother's estate. The court order explicitly detailed that every single cent derived from Collier's bloodline would be distributed as restitution to the young men and women he had terrorized. Collier dropped the paper. His hands shook violently. He had nothing left. No freedom, no money, no family, no legacy. He was a man erased from the world, left to rot in a cage of his own making, funding the prosperous futures of his victims. He curled onto his side, facing the cold concrete wall, and wept in absolute, unbroken silence. A short distance away, the autumn air at the military base was crisp and clean. The parade field was meticulously manicured, the grass a vibrant striking green against the gray concrete of the grandstands. Major Kendra Blake stood at attention, the brass buttons of her dress uniform gleaming in the morning sun. A gentle breeze ruffled the flags of the airborne division arrayed behind her. She stood alongside a line of distinguished officers, but all eyes were on her. The base commander, flanked by General Harlan Prescott, stepped forward to the podium. Today, we honor an officer who embodies the absolute highest virtues of the military police corps. The commander's voice echoed over the PA system. Major Kendra Blake demonstrated exceptional courage, flawless tactical execution, and an unwavering commitment to the law in the face of imminent lethal danger. Her actions not only saved lives in a federal courtroom, but they also dismantled a systemic threat to the soldiers of this installation. General Prescott stepped forward holding a small velvet box. He removed the Legion of Merit, one of the military's highest non-combat decorations, and pinned it meticulously to Kendra's chest. "Outstanding work, Major," Prescott murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Just doing the job, sir," Kendra replied quietly, her face a mask of perfect, disciplined stoicism. As the military band struck up the regimental march, Kendra looked out over the sea of young enlisted soldiers standing in formation. She saw the faces of the privates, the corporals, the young men and women who volunteered to serve their country, entirely unaware of the complex, shadowy wars fought to protect them on their own soil. She did not smile. She did not seek their adoration. She knew that predators would always exist, men who sought to use power as a weapon rather than a shield. But as the brass music swelled, she touched the cool metal of the medal on her chest, secure in the knowledge that as long as she wore the uniform, those predators would eventually find themselves standing in the dark, waiting for the karma they so richly deserved. Justice is often depicted wearing a blindfold, a symbol meant to represent total impartiality. Yet the story of the county proves that true justice Richard Collier built an empire on the illusion of power, weaponizing a badge to prey upon those sworn to defend the nation. He believed his authority insulated him from the laws of consequence. But when confronted by the uncompromising discipline of Major Kendra Blake, that illusion was shattered in agonizing moments. The aftermath was not merely a legal victory. It was a devastating manifestation of real-world karma. Collier's hubris activated a domino effect that dismantled a corrupt municipality, exposed a criminal syndicate, and ultimately reduced him to a forgotten, impoverished ghost locked within a concrete cage. It stands as a chilling, undeniable testament. The weight of corruption may feel profitable in the moment, but the bill always comes due, and the universe collects with absolute terrifying precision.